Well, I'm excited to have with me today Jay Kim. Jay, welcome. Glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Happy to be on.
Well, I'd love to give folks who are listening a chance to get to know you a little bit. I've met you through a mutual friend, Dan Kimball. Tell me about your
Mhm.
life pre-vintage faith and how you even ended up working with Dan.
Yeah, Dan Kimball, obviously a dear friend, mutual friend of ours. I grew up in the Silicon Valley. I've been here basically my entire life, and uh, um, dropped out of the state university when I was like 21, and enrolled in Bible college. That's a whole long story, but was really passionate about youth ministry. So I spent 8 years serving high school and middle school students, and in the midst of that, got into college ministry and young adult ministry, and then spent some time helping plant a church, and then went to the polar opposite end of the spectrum as a teaching pastor at a large multi-site church here in the Silicon Valley. And right in the middle of that whole journey, Dan Kimball and I met, and we started working together. I started helping him with something that he started called the ReGeneration Project.
Mhm.
So we've been working on that together. And then for the last 4 years, long story short, we decided to serve alongside each other at the same church, at Vintage Faith
That's
Church.
great.
So that's been yeah, a blast.
I love it. Well, one of my favorite lattes I've ever had was at the Abbey there
Oh yeah.
at Vintage Faith. And how do you like living in Santa Cruz? Did you relocate to live there?
No, so I still live in Silicon Valley, which is about a 30-minute drive into Vintage Faith. So I have my feet in both worlds. It's kind of fascinating and interesting, and yeah, we've got some family stuff going on here in the Silicon Valley that sort of keeps us here with our two young kids, and help we've got with our parents, my wife and I, both of our parents. And so yeah, we're just doing the commute deal, but yeah, it's been fun to be in Santa Cruz serving, and challenging. It's a challenging
Hmm.
place.
Yeah.
Incredibly post-Christian, really eclectic, and
Hmm.
but that's the fun of it. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, what have you found that Vintage Faith does well? Not just you and Dan, but even the people in your church as they're reaching out, trying to connect people to faith. What do you see working there? What's helping people?
yeah, well, Santa Cruz is interesting. Where we are on the west side of Santa Cruz, we're about a mile and a half down the road from the big state university, UC Santa Cruz. And so the west side of Santa Cruz is actually it's highly educated, uh, and people sort of like asking tough questions. There's a lot of cynicism for sure. So for us, because of that, and for lots of reasons, but an emphasis on theology and digging deep into the scriptures and asking hard questions about the story of God and what He might be up to in the world. Those a sort of thoughtful Christianity has been really important for us and has been effective for us. So that's been a big part of it. Like you mentioned, we have a coffee shop at our church called the Abbey. It's open 7 days a week. It's open during our Sunday worship gatherings, and so it's full of people 7 days a week who could care less about Jesus and about faith, and many who are actually quite antagonistic toward Christianity, and yet they like our coffee. And so a thoughtful Christianity has really been helpful, because conversations happen all the time. I mean, I'm in conversations with people who are not Christian in our coffee shop on a fairly regular basis, and they have really tough questions.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's sort of one leaning we have as a church community that we found incredibly helpful
Yeah.
as we try to missionally reach a very post-Christian and intellectual place like the west side of Santa Cruz.
I love it. And I think that part of, my experience, even being at Vintage Faith a time or two, was seeing how the staff, not just of the church, but the coffee shop, does interact and doesn't mind getting into those conversations. It's not that people are unwilling to talk about spiritual things. It's actually more like what you described. They love to talk about it, and they've come to pretty clear convictions on it. How has actually pointing them towards the scriptures, and how have those conversations become fruitful? How have you seen those conversations work? Because we don't want to get into a debate every time you see someone. So tell me how you help people make that turn.
Yeah, well, I think so much of it has to do with focusing on our posture before we focus on our position. And what I mean by that is we want to make sure that no matter what the differences may be between us and the person we're trying to, reach and love and serve and share the gospel with, the first thing we're thinking about is our posture toward them one of kindness and generosity and openness and love. Because if we can have that posture, then no matter what our theological position, the posture has a way of, and I experienced this firsthand many times, our posture has a way of either disarming or really pushing away a person who might be willing or even not willing to have a meaningful conversation with you about it. So we tell our staff that all the time. And like you said, when you come into our coffee shop, our baristas there, they're told all the time in monthly training meetings, your posture toward the customer, no matter who they are, where they're coming from, whatever they're dealing with, whatever their position on whatever thing, our posture is the primary means by which we are going to express the love of Christ to them. And that hopefully we hope and pray opens the door to having conversations about our position on whatever, various
Mhm.
things. But the posture is the key. So, again, posture of kindness, generosity, love is so crucial. And I've just found in my own life, in my interactions with folks at our church who come into the Abbey, people who don't know Jesus, even if we end the conversation in disagreement about a particular idea or position, if the posture is, again, one of love and kindness and generosity, they almost always leave with a smile on their face,
Mm.
and a renewed sense of what a follower of Jesus actually is like, a deconstructing of the caricatures they have, and a renewed sense of, oh man, Christians are actually kind and loving. So,
Well, and I love that because I do think it's very much wrapped up in not just what but how you treat someone. What are some of the questions that you do find are being asked a lot? What are some of the kind of last issues that people might have before moving towards an open-mindedness? Have you found some similarities between people in their journeys?
yeah, for us in Santa Cruz, and this may be specific to us, but I think it's common to a lot of post-Christian places like Santa Cruz. I would just say candidly, the number one question we get is the question of human sexuality. People are
Mhm.
asking us that all the time,
Mhm.
and the caricature they have about our church and about Christians as a whole when they approach us with the question is that if we hold a particular view or position on human sexuality or on gender, that it must categorically mean that we're bigots and that we hate anybody who doesn't hold our view. So that's a conversation that happens all the time. And it is actually quite fruitful. Again, going back to my earlier point, when they see that our posture is a particular way, even if we have differences of opinion on our position on the matter, people typically walk away with a sense of, again, a deconstruction of the caricature they had. They
Yeah.
at least walk away with the understanding, oh, they're not like bigots, they don't hate people, they're actually driven by love. And so that's a really common one. And another one we get all the time is pluralism. Like, why is there an exclusivity to the Christian God? Why do you say that Jesus is the only way? Don't all paths lead to the one true God? And so that's a conversation that happens a lot as well. And that might be because we live in a unique place like Santa Cruz. We serve in a unique place like Santa Cruz where everyone hates religion but loves spirituality. Like
Hmm.
it's a
Yeah.
fascinating dichotomy. So
Yeah.
uh, I would assume, Austin is similar in
Yeah.
those ways. But
For sure.
yeah, those are the conversations that happen a lot.
Well, and how do you help someone when that pluralism question, especially? I loved how you reframed moving past the caricature, of people of faith, like you might see on the news, or to be honest, and I know you'd agree with this too, there are a lot of believers that have been very outspoken against and probably are bigoted against, the LGBTQ community. But how do you help someone with the pluralism? How do you help them keep or even start pursuing Jesus in the midst of all their questions about what about all these other faiths?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it right there, Eric. It's we try to bring it back to Jesus. So rather than debate philosophy, for us, our approach is to paint as compelling of a picture as possible of this ancient, first century Jewish rabbi named Jesus who claimed to be the Son of God, and then went to the cross and died. And then the hinge point, for the
Mhm.
conversation always is going to be, did he actually come back to life? Is resurrection real? Because if it isn't, then obviously it's all a hoax. But if it is, then at the very minimum, it demands our attention. If a man died and rose again. So
Mm.
without getting into all the sort of classic apologetics of the resurrection, in some form or fashion, it always ends up coming back to that place where,
Mm.
who is Jesus? And certainly, whether you believe he's God or not, it's undeniable that he is one of, if not the central figure in human history. I mean,
Mm. Yeah.
the way we date our calendar hinges
Mhm.
upon his life, So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, uh yeah, we just try to paint a compelling picture, a vision of who Jesus is, and why we are so compelled by his story. And then rather than trying to convince or coerce someone, we just try to share honestly about why we are so incredibly compelled by him, and hopefully that opens hearts and minds.
I love it. Part of what was fun with Dan, back when I was at Mosaic with Irwin, we created this
Hmm.
group called the Origins Project, and we were really intentional
Hmm.
about communicating what followers of Jesus are for, because we were so known for what we were against, and we made it clear that we're for Jesus, we're for people, and we're for innovation. And it was a fun season doing the Origins Project together, and I think Regeneration was kind of what came next for him. And it's been fun to see what you guys are doing uh,
That's right.
with that ministry and that effort. Let me ask you about your book. You have a book that's about to come out. I just got a copy of it. I'm excited to start reading
Yeah.
it. And it's got a great title, and maybe even an ironic title in light of what's happening in our world in the middle of this pandemic, when we're recording this. Tell us about the book.
Yeah, thanks for asking. The book is called Analog Church: Why We Need Real People, Places, and Things in the Digital Age. And yes, the irony is not lost on me that I am releasing a book suggesting that the church needs to continue gathering in embodied ways at a time when that's actually not the right thing to do. So,
Right, right.
um, but yeah, the book essentially is basically an exploration of the intersection between our ecclesiology, what we believe the church to be, and how we can move forward into the future as the church, and the digital age, and all of the technologies uh, and advancements that the digital age offers us. And yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to do a fairly simple, but to me, a really important thing, which is to ask church leaders in particular and followers of Jesus in general to consider more carefully and thoughtfully the ways in which our sort of digital leanings and digital tendencies, our immersion into digital technologies at the church level, at the ecclesiological level, may be affecting and actually, in some ways, harming, when we're not careful and thoughtful, harming um, our understanding and our experience of what it means to be the church together.
Hmm.
So, obviously we're in a strange time where we have to be digital. Our church is digital now, as all churches, I think, at least in the Western world and throughout the world now, um, are. So it's fascinating, and I'm wrestling with that quite a bit and thinking about it. But there you go. That's the book. Yeah.
Well, and to me, honestly, I feel like the message is going to be even more important. Honestly, what we're experiencing now, certainly in Austin, we've been in this shelter in place for about a week. It sounds like it's going to last at least a month. It could go longer, and even what you're seeing in Hong Kong, they kind of started letting people back out, so to speak. And now it sounds like they're going back into more of a shelter in place again as the virus is continuing to spread. So I want to at some point talk about what you see happening after all of this, because there will be a new normal, even post pandemic. But I do wonder, right now, I saw the article you wrote, even about this, in spite of what we're going through, here's why this is still important. Maybe share some of the points from that article, because I thought that was really helpful, talking about, this is temporary, but why it's so important. Like, after this, there may be a resurgence of attendance at events.
Mhm.
We're going to want to be out with people. We want to hug after being so isolated. Tell me some of your thoughts in the middle of this pandemic of how can the church be more analog, even though we're having to be digital.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the opportunity before us is it's becoming clearer and clearer by the day, actually, which to me is very hopeful in the midst of this really um, strange, crazy, and fearful time.
Mhm.
There's a sort of hopefulness in that every single day. I mean, just think about this. We actually have right now at our disposal more ability and capability, more tools to stay, and I'm using air quotes here, but to stay connected
Mhm.
while physically apart than we've ever had in the rest of human history combined.
Mhm.
If you can imagine, if COVID-19 had happened 25 years ago, what would we do? I mean,
Yeah.
we'd be on the phone calling each other, certainly, but beyond that, it'd be tough. It'd be really tough. But now, every day, I'm on a Zoom call with several people. Meetings are no problem. It's
Mhm.
actually really convenient in some ways, as long as
Mhm.
my Wi-Fi is working okay. It's really convenient. I just
Mhm.
log on, and I don't have to drive anywhere. And yet, in the midst of that, in the midst of the fact that we have more tools at our disposal than ever before to make this work, there is still a rising angst, anxiety, a sort of fatigue with this really disembodied disruption. And
Mhm.
I think the hope there is that, and you said it, Eric, the hope there is that while we are in this time, as leaders especially, but all of us, if we can really begin to remind one another and help people, especially followers of Jesus, lean into the angst and the fatigue we feel at our physical disconnection right now, it can raise the awareness, heighten the awareness that as embodied human beings, as physical material beings made in the image of God out of dirt and flesh, the stuff of earth, as Genesis 2 tells us, then when this is over, it'll be a celebration. It'll be a sort of
Mhm.
like, oh man, we can finally come out from behind our digital walls and be physically embodied. Incarnational is the theological word, in the flesh with one
Mhm.
another.
Yeah.
And then we'll have a whole nother thing we'll have to do to make sure that that lasts and becomes something that becomes embedded in us as followers of Jesus. But for now, I'm hopeful that when this is over, this season will have heightened our awareness of our deep need for embodied presence with one another. There are several things we have to do, I think, as leaders to make that happen and ensure that happens. But that's the opportunity, I think,
I
before
think
us.
you're right. Absolutely. And why don't you just share, just in the midst of like what you think it could look like in this new world? What do leaders need to do to help people stay more connected, and all that comes with that more incarnational ministry?
Yeah, well, I think absolutely we need to lean into digital right now because it is the right thing to do for the common good, driven by our love for neighbor, right? This
Mhm.
is, we are caring for the most vulnerable amongst us. Although now, there are stories of, man, coronavirus, this novel coronavirus might be more dangerous than we thought. So it's certainly for the common good. We need to shelter in place and keep our physical distance. But in the midst of this, as it forces us into digital space, I think for leaders in particular, we have to communicate very clearly and consistently to our people that this is a temporary compromise rather than an ongoing convenience.
Mm.
That digital technologies are great supplemental tools. And I know a lot of churches have already had online presence, and I don't think that's bad. I think that's great. But the online presence has to be communicated as a supplemental tool. When you're traveling and you're gone, this is a supplemental tool to keep you connected. And you can watch the sermon and
Mhm.
chat with folks. Very similar to when I travel and I'm away from home. I love that on my phone I can FaceTime with my family, see my wife and kids. But because it's supplemental, that experience of FaceTiming at its finest, what it does is it primarily heightens my awareness of my longing and desire to get back home and hold my real kids in my real arms and give them real hugs. And
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to do in this season. And even in digital spaces, I think we need to try our best to invite participation rather than simply informing and presenting content. And people are already trying to do that in some creative ways, and I'm encouraged by that. But in unique ways to our unique communities, we need to be thinking, I think, through that lens. How do we use digital mediums to invite participation rather than simply informing and presenting content? And that's a challenge, but it's a challenge that I think is one that we need to take on in order to lean people into analog experiences.
That's great. Well, if someone wants to read more of what you do, certainly find the book. Is there a website you would point them towards?
Yeah, just my website, jkimthinks.com, really simple. And yeah, the book stuff is on there as well as the stuff I work on with Dan Kimball, the ReGeneration Project, and info about our church. So everything's there. And then the book itself, you can find it wherever they sell books. So,
Excellent. Excellent. Well, it's
yeah.
great to have you, Jay. Thank you so much for joining us. And just keep up your great work there on the West Coast.
Yeah, appreciate it, Eric. Appreciate the work you're doing in Austin as well. So thanks for the time.